Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to focus upon environmentalism, sustainable development, as well as look at some of the tension spots around the world. My guest today is an expert on these topics. Dr. John B. Cobb Jr. is a renowned American theologian, philosopher, and environmentalist. Dr. John Cobb, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's just jump right into this and talk about, you've dealt with so many different concepts, important concepts that affect people worldwide. One is that you had a concept called ecological civilization, and you described this as an alternative to the modern industrial age. What exactly did you mean by that?
Okay. Well, the term ecological civilization was initially in some United Nations literature, not. And then it was picked up in China. And I learned it actually from the Chinese. And the Chinese, both the Chinese parliament and the Communist Party have indicated that they are committed to moving to an ecological civilization. Now, I think their meaning is more limited than the one that I would like to encourage. And we've had the opportunity to work to develop it among Chinese. So it has grown and developed. The term ecological suggests both that we are interested in the relationship of human life to the natural world, and also that the natural world and human life should be integrated in a way to the benefit of all. The idea of an ecology is a system of highly diverse things that nevertheless work together so that the whole flourishes. So that's the kind of world we would like to live in, not one based on competition and seeing who's the best, and that the best then destroys the others, but a world that is based primarily on cooperation.
That's very true. And that would be the internal functioning of the parts would deal more harmoniously and in coordination and cooperation with each other. So
that's right.
Certainly an ideal way to do it, no doubt about that. Now, you've done a Communities of the Future paper, and one quote that I remember or copied was that endings and beginnings, unquote. You state that, quote, the civilization that we hope to transform into is politically and militarily deeply divided, while industrially and technologically it is intricately interconnected. What do you mean by that? And what are these unique challenges that we have? That we have this division, but we still have this interlinkage and interdependence that will always be there. We can't get away from it.
Yes, I think that particular quote did not say what, I mean, if there was some mistake about it. It should have had the word "not" in it. So
it should have had "not." Okay. Okay. So that's a major word.
It's a very important word, and I didn't look up the paper, but when I read it, I couldn't quite figure out what I could have meant. But I think that it was talking about, we're not talking about a world which is based upon military issues, and how it's a world that is based on cooperation about the economy and about how we all deal with the natural world, and about how human beings think of themselves in relationship to one another and to the other creatures with which we inhabit. And of course, even in an ecology, some eat others. It's not a matter of that.
Exactly right.
It doesn't mean that human beings have to simply be nice to all other animals, but it does mean that the utter cruelty of the way we produce our meat these days is not totally unacceptable. If in an ecology, there has to be respect for all forms. And the fact that some feed on others doesn't give them a kind of dictatorial control that gives no consideration to the others.
That's very true. This is a different society that we're talking about today. It's one that's more compassionate. It's one that's more understanding. It's more cooperative. It's not as much of a dog eat dog type of world or survival of the fittest. What type of leadership do you see as you look into your futuristic all, if you will, of what type of leadership do we need to help us move into that? Because it's certainly a more desirable situation as I see it anyway.
Yes.
So how do we get there?
How do we get there? That is, of course, the 64. I mean, that's the question we all wish we knew the answers to. But I think that there has been considerable movement in many dimensions of the culture that are promising. There are other movements that are just the opposite, of course. But there are a lot of people today who think that the natural world, apart from us, can teach us some things, and that there is value in the lives of other animals besides the human animal. The vision of ourselves as utterly separate from the rest of the world. In other words, the dualism that characterized Western thinking for a very long time. There are human beings on the one side, and then the rest is all there for the sake of human beings. That was ended, should have been completely ended by evolutionary thinking. But nevertheless, it reasserts itself. And for practical purposes, many corporations divide the world into the corporation and the rest, and are looking out only for the corporation and not for the whole. But there are lots of people, I think, today who respond well to the idea that human beings won't flourish if the rest of the planet is exhausted. And if we practice cruelty toward other creatures, there's a strong tendency that it damages us too.
And that certainly applies to environmental degradation. If we
Yes.
destroy the planet, and we are on the trajectory with the climate crisis now, it's no longer
Exactly.
going to change. We're heading in that direction. But they're also, and of course, they had the UN COP26 conference in Scotland
Yes.
a few weeks ago, and hopefully nations of the world are more motivated to get involved in combating this climate change and developing clean energy, move away from fossil fuels. We know what to do. We just have moneyed interests that don't allow us to move that way, don't we?
Well, the greatest obstacle to a conference like that succeeding is the fact that the United States is so committed to being the dominant power that it treats China as, very frequently calls China enemy number one. And then when you have an enemy, you can spend almost an unlimited amount of money on defense. So that whereas the United States is not able to vote money for human health and welfare, it's having great difficulty getting even a fraction of the original goal through. It votes almost unlimited amounts of money for what's called defense. And of course, almost all of the defense is really created for offense. The United States is not in danger of attack from some other country, so we can't use that as an excuse. So at that conference, the two greatest powers in the world were devoting much more of their time and energy on destroying the other, or weakening the other, than they were on cooperating to save the planet. Nevertheless, there was a recognition on the part of both that when it comes to some issues, in spite of the fact they're enemies on other topics, some issues they better cooperate. And that door got cracked a little bit wider. So I consider there was a gain, but still, if our priority is to destroy any country that threatens our global domination, that is not the priority that is going to save us from self-destruction.
That is a very important topic, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a wide range of issues, from climate change to environmental degradation to competition and perhaps conflict between and among countries. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. John B. Cobb Jr. is a renowned American theologian, philosopher, and environmentalist. Dr. Cobb, I'm glad you mentioned that about the defense budget. We may think back or read about or maybe even heard former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who in his closing days when he was leaving in 1960, made the prediction or the warning, really, that we needed to be very wary of the military, industrial, and I think he said congressional complex, because this had been a conglomeration of interests that were together to simply to build hardware, overpriced hardware in many cases, to the American military, all on the assumption that they needed it for defense. The Government Accountability Office has shown time after time that we're wasting at least 20 cents on every dollar. So our current budget, the defense budget, which is almost $800 billion, we're wasting about 180, 190 billion, if that is indeed correct. But how do we cut this down? Because it's gotten to the point now where congressional members of Congress feel that the defense budget is really an employment budget. It's an economic development budget, and nobody wants to give up. For example, I remember the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, years ago mentioned that he did not want to close down a tank factory in his district because it would put so many hundreds of people out of work. And the military has said they don't want tanks. We're not living in the tank era anymore. The things will rust in the desert or something. But how do we overcome that?
Well, I think that in order to justify this budget, we have to persuade the American people that we're under some kind of a threat. And so we try to create a threat. Neither China nor Russia, nor even the Soviet Union before then had any intention whatsoever of attacking us. But there is a way we can say we're in threat if it is the proper destiny of the United States to have complete dominance over the entire planet, then any independent country is a threat. I think if we could persuade the American people that it's more important to share a living planet rather than to control a dead one, that we could undercut a lot of what's going on at the present time. But we don't discuss that. In elections, there's very, very little talk about the defense budget. Congressmen don't have to say what they think about that. It's just sort of sacred that the more money you spend on what you called defense is the more secure you are, which is, of course, not in no way true. In my view, the fact that that particular part of the budget is not actually, we have no good records of where the money goes. If we would just say, the Defense Department must tell us exactly how it spends its money, that it be audited like everything else, that would make a huge difference.
It certainly would. And everybody wants a strong defense. I have not met anybody.
Strong defense is fine, but we don't get a stronger defense by most of what we're doing with the defense budget.
Exactly right. And the GAO and some of the governmental auditing agencies can't even determine where the money's gone. They've said over the years the trillions of dollars in the Defense Department have been wasted or stolen or whatever.
So we already know we're wasting most of the money, but that doesn't bother us because nobody knows who is stealing the money. Stealing is not quite the right word, but some of it, I think, goes rather directly into some pockets.
Well, we used to pay for $600 toilet seats and $200 bolts and that type of thing. Certainly overpriced, but the Defense Department budget is a major issue, and we really need to focus on it. But before we run out of time, I want to talk about a major flashpoint. We've seen that there's been a tremendous, I think, increase in tension between the U.S. and China recently.
Yes.
And of course, some people I know in the Biden administration say that China is not an enemy. It's a competitor, but we work with them. But by the same token, you've got people in China, I'm sure, and here that are really rattling their swords, saber rattling to some degree, to try to get some type of conflict. And you hear this between trying to get the United States involved in a conflict with China. And also, we also hear it on Iran. You hear the Iran bashers saying we're going to have to go to war with Iran. Well, the United States, in my opinion, made the mistake by pulling out of the Iranian Nuclear Deal. And now Iran is starting to develop its nuclear capacity to develop a nuclear weapon. Well, we messed up on that badly when Trump pulled out of it. Now we need to rectify it. But let's go back to Asia for a moment. What can be done to diffuse this tension between China and the United States? Because if we had a nuclear conflict, nobody would win, and this planet would probably be destroyed. We don't have to wait for climate change, but what can be done to ratchet down the tension and the rhetoric and also the moneyed interest, the military industrial complex that's out here trying to ramp it up so they can sell more F-35 jets that don't fly half the time? What can we do about that?
Well, if the United States wanted to do something about it, it could end that tension very, very quickly. China would much prefer to have peaceful relationships. The problem is that when we have a peaceful situation, the Chinese make use of it more effectively than we do. So that makes us angry. The one area in which we have superiority over China is the military. The Chinese are doing better economically than we are. So we don't want a peaceful world. I don't mean by we, everybody. I just mean the people who are calling the shots. They want to find some excuse for preventing China from continuing on its positive path. The Chinese want to continue. If we will let them continue, I mean, that doesn't mean that you have to, if they are engaged in unfair competition in some way, by all means, deal with it, but you don't have to have a nuclear war to deal with that. I'm not trying to paint the Chinese as innocent people. They are very skillful people who can make use of every opportunity. And they have been outplaying us. There was a time when the United States was a very much admired nation. It had moral reputation. We have destroyed our own moral reputation. Mm-hmm. So now we can only control things by force. Economic force, sanctions, is one of the ways we control. But then the threat of military regime change is another way we control. But the Chinese have some moral force now. They are able to help developing countries. So all we have left to ourselves as a way in which we are superior to the Chinese is the military. And we're so determined to remain number one, and not just number one in the group of competitors, but number one, with no serious competitors. We have to give up that vision of ourselves. There's no reason the United States should be the one and only great power in the world. It's all right to have multiple powers, but that's hard to persuade people of that quickly.
Right. After World War II, the U.S. was the dominant player, and then we had a sort of a bipolar world with the USSR and the United States. But today, it's much more of a multipolar world, and there's a distribution of power and amongst a variety of countries. But now, you not long ago, you were very concerned about this Chinese-U.S. relationship, and you developed a declaration of concern that you sent to President Xi Jinping of China and President Joe Biden. What basically did it say, and what did it recommend?
Well, one thing it asked was that Joe Biden stop calling China an enemy. And it's very interesting, but he did make a speech in which he said, China is our competitor, not our enemy. Now, I'm not saying that my letter had anything to do with it, but it was wonderful that he made the change. And on the other hand, it looked like China, as long as the U.S. treated it as an enemy, China did not see how it could work in a cooperative way on any topics with the United States. And so I specifically asked President Xi that if Joe Biden would make any gestures toward improvement, that he would use the occasion to cooperate. And he did come to the conference, and he and Biden have created a committee of people, very influential people, which will be discussing how the United States and China could give some global leadership in environmental matters. So what I asked for in the letter is happening. That doesn't mean that that's just the first step. What will happen in this committee and how anything that this committee does will actually affect US or Chinese policies, we simply don't know. But at least there is a group of people from the two countries that are doing what needs to be done. If we could then if we could begin cooperation there and then extend it to other areas, there really is a chance. I'm always desperately looking for a chance because the direction the world is going is not promising.
It's a little pessimistic from time to time. And of course, as we look back over history, well, Winston Churchill said, it's better to jaw than war. Yeah, he's absolutely right. And of course, when the United Nations was created in 1945, the idea was for the five winners, basically, of World War II, the United States, France, the old USSR, the UK, and let's see, I'm trying to...
China.
China's in there, sure. And of course, they would come together to keep world peace and that type of thing. Of course, we saw that the Cold War started right after, basically before the ink on the charter of the UN dried in 1945. But today, we see that the United Nations is still playing a role. And over the years, over the decades, we've seen where the UN, through backdoor diplomacy, through bringing the parties together, has really diffused many major conflicts. In fact, a lot of foreign policy analysts say that the UN has helped prevent World War III. Now, we can't prove that one way or the other, but we do know with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came within one button being pushed to have a nuclear exchange with the former Soviet Union. But what role do you see for the United Nations to be the peacemaker and to bring these parties together and to hopefully to promote a dialogue, not to enforce anything on them or to force it, but to maintain a dialogue to defuse the situation?
Well, I think the United States feels that it wants to control the United Nations, and it uses improper means. And so the United Nations is not looked at by Russia and China as a kind of neutral body. I think that if we wanted, we could change that. And I think the United Nations has maintained more independence of the United States than the United States likes. So I still look to it for help and leadership, but there's too much of a sense of how many votes can we count on. And the reason we can count on them are multiple, but they are too often that they have somebody who we have put into power by regime change. Or they're a country that if they knows if we don't vote, if they don't vote the way we want, the sanctions will become worse. And that we need to give up that kind of power. It's not as powerful as people think it is. Military and economical power, I think, are not as powerful as moral power. And our self-destruction of the moral power we once had in the world is very sad. It would be wonderful if we worked to reclaim it. And I think we could.
It certainly can be. And I think you're right. Of course, a large number of the 193 countries at the UN, they, excuse me. Wow. I'm glad we're about done because I'm losing my voice. Well, anyway, here we go. I think you're right. And the majority of the 193 countries at the United Nations, they do want to have influence up there. And the UN is still the dominant force at the United Nations, but China has moved in to fill a lot of the vacuum that the UN has abdicated, a lot of the areas of influence. And of course, it's constantly shifting. But again, Dr. Cobb, we've just touched upon some of the major problems of the world today. I don't know if we've solved them. I think we've come close to solving some of them. But again, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.